Yeah. Okay. Thank you, folks, for joining us for our first spring semester colloquium. When I first sent it out yesterday, I think I said fall semester, and I apologize. Thank you, Peyton, for catching that. But that's okay. So we are very, very happy to welcome my colleague, Dr. Tom Jordan, who is an associate professor of criminal justice. And he's going to be speaking to us today on missing pieces in evaluation of experiential learning. So we're going to let Dr. Jordan present, then we should probably have some time for questions and such like at the end. So yeah, Dr. Jordan, take it away. Thank you.
I'm going to try to make this long enough so that no one has time for questions. I hate to be questioned. Just accept it as the truth. All right.
That's fair.
So, well, number one, thank you guys for coming to I think this is the first honors colloquium of the semester. I appreciate y'all, and those of you that are joining us online, appreciate y'all joining us. My name is Tom Jordan. I am from here. I've been here for a day or two, and I've been doing criminal justice stuff for a little bit longer than that. So. The title here is Missing Pieces. And what we're talking about here, essentially the context, if you will, is teaching in college, right? I know you guys have kind of heard the old joke about, college professors only work 12 hours a week, right?
At most.
If it were true, that would be great, right? But we actually do spend a lot of time, thinking about how to structure classes so that students will learn. And I think that's true of people teaching at all levels of education, whether, elementary, middle school, high school, college, graduate school, professional schools. We're interested in our students learning. And so we think a lot about, is there something that I can do differently or better that's going to improve those outcomes? And so what I'm talking about today is the presentation is based on a research project that I started, a year and a half ago. And I'm actually working on revisions for a journal article now on this particular project. So my button just quit working. That's great. There we go. So a little context, right? When we talk about missing pieces, right? The idea of that is that, we often, as professors, we see how our students perform and we ask ourselves, what's missing? What is it that we can do differently? And, for me personally, one of the things that I have done is focus on teaching research methods. Research was my substantive area along with law enforcement in my doctoral program. And so I taught my first research methods class in about 1994. So I've done it for a long time, but that doesn't mean that I don't think about, are there ways to do it better and differently, right? And so when we think about experiential learning here at A&M Texarkana, okay, we can actually kind of put a focus on our university accreditation. Right now, we are going through a process for reaccreditation or reaffirmation of our university accreditation. And part of that process every 10 years is that we develop a quality enhancement plan, which we shorten to QEP. And it's essentially an approach that an institution will take to try to figure out, hey, are there things that we can do better to improve student learning outcomes? It might be a fairly narrow focus, or it can be a very broad focus. And the last time we did this, we chose experiential learning, and it's a very broad focus. Our goal was that every undergraduate in our institution would have the opportunity to take at least one experiential learning based course in their major before they graduated. Now, in criminal justice, we actually already had an experiential course. We have had an internship course since our degree began back in the 90s before I ever came here. And so we kind of had that base covered. But as I thought about experiential learning, I wondered, are there other ways that we can implement that? And research methods in criminal justice, it is generally a required course in criminal justice curricula across the nation. It's something that the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences expects us to include and require. And it's generally thought of as the most difficult class in criminal justice curriculum, right? And it's not always true. When I was an undergraduate, our law classes, common law was, oh my gosh, it was terrible. It was so hard, but generally research methods it's pretty difficult, right? And so for years, I thought about, is there a different way to teach research methods so that our students are able to grasp it and learn it better? And so as I thought about experiential learning, right? The basic theory, and I am simplifying here, but the basic theory of experiential learning is that if you have students work on an actual applied project, a real world problem, if you will, that they will actually be more motivated to spend time with their subject matter, okay? So we've got the motivation factor. It's just more interesting when you're working on something real, okay? And then the other element is that with adding experiential learning or restructuring for experiential learning, the one thing that it implies, and frankly not enough attention is given to this detail, is that experiential learning tends to take more time. But with that heightened degree of motivation, we expect students to be willing and even want to invest more time in the learning process. So that's fundamentally what we're talking about. And notice we have that extra element there of reflection, okay? So part of this experiential learning approach is that you're working on something, but then you pause and you stop to think about it. What is the connection between what I'm working on and the more abstract ideas I might be learning from the textbook or from lecture? How do these things go together? And how can I understand them in a deeper sense, all right? And again, that ends up being more time. So undergraduate research, having undergraduate students do more hands-on research as opposed to just a research paper, right? But actually like doing original analysis is considered a high impact practice in higher education. And what that means is that one, it's expected to help students learn more, but two, it is expected to essentially kind of touch that student emotionally so that they are more likely to embrace not just their course of study and their discipline, but also even their institution, right? And so this approach kind of fit these different bills, if you will. For us in criminal justice, research techniques is a required course. And so it becomes a good candidate for potentially reforming the class around the experiential learning. And so that's what I did. Essentially, now I'm going to show you in a second a chart, but I'll just go ahead and tell you. In 2017, I did kind of a pilot semester where I redid what I was doing in the class, but I was really just trying to figure out, it wasn't really a super structured approach. I was just trying to figure out what could I give my students that they could do without becoming frustrated. Because back in about 2011, I had tried to flip this class, which basically means you expect the students to do a lot of reading and studying, and then in your class time, you do discussion and hands-on things. And that 2011 semester was a train wreck. It was a smoking pile. It was terrible. And so, I don't know, 30, 50% of the way through the semester, I had to call an audible and just say, stop. And we had to just kind of, salvage what we could from that semester. But, we learned from failure. That semester was a failure. But it also taught me something about, if I try this again, what are some lessons that I've learned to make it more successful? And so 2017, I do something like that where I'm like trying to figure out, okay, what exactly can I ask of my students? They're going to be able to do it without becoming frustrated and just like, yeah, I can't do this. All right. And so 2018 comes along, and I now have this structured set of experiential learning approach, if you will, to give to the undergraduates, and we're going to work through it. And it actually went quite smoothly. Had to make another change in 2019, I think it was, or 2020. Not related to how the course was going, but because of some ethical rules that the university changed in terms of undergraduates doing research and what they could do to do human studies research and that kind of thing. It just became too onerous, so I had to take a different project approach. But same basic idea, right? There was a sequence set of research tasks. The research, the readings and the lecture were kind of aligned with those tasks sequentially. And I always throw this out there because the thing that my students fear about the class is that, oh my gosh, I got to learn statistics and I hate math, And so in my research class, I don't actually teach, statistics per se. I teach statistical logic using, some fairly basic mathematics. So I tell my students, like, literally the arithmetic we use, you learned in the 6th and 7th grade. So if you can do, percentages and averages, you're going to be fine. Okay. And so that is, what I did. This is how I put the course together. And so this project that I have worked on and I'm continuing to write up is essentially a look back. We call it a post hoc analysis, right? Way back in 2010, I didn't think to myself, hey, 13 years from now, I'm going to analyze this data for a research project, right? We call this the use of secondary data, okay? It's data that was collected through test scores. And I just happen to have them archived in files, right? So I have all these test scores going back for a decade. And one day it occurs to me that, hey, I could actually kind of go back and see, this experiential learning model actually make a significant difference in what students are learning. So there you see, in terms of the data I had from 2010 to 2016, these were the traditional versions of the class that I've been teaching for many years. In 2017, I kind of did this test bed thing. It wasn't really a fully experiential. It wasn't really a fully traditional. They did not take the regular tests that I normally give. And then starting in 2018 through the spring of 23, we did this experiential learning version of the course, where students actually work on a research project and analysis project throughout the semester. So, one of the issues, now I will just back up and say, one of the reasons that I'm interested in this experiential learning is that I had a significant hand in writing our quality enhancement plan a decade ago. And one of the things that was interesting about the literature and having read it, some more of it since then, is that when people evaluate experiential learning, they rarely will use kind of a significant, fairly rigorous quantitative model. Instead, most of the evaluation tends to be fairly qualitative, where they're asking the students, what did you think? Okay. Now there's value in that, okay, but it doesn't really tell us whether or not they learned anymore. Even if we ask you, did you think this helped your learning? And you say yes, we don't actually know that it did. Okay? Because our perceptions of what we know turns out not to be very accurate. And my question was, does experiential learning demonstrably increase core knowledge of the subject? Now, I think of core knowledge as the stuff that I test my students on, right? If I'm going to write a test question for it, it's probably because I think I wanted you to have learned it, okay? And a lot of the evaluations don't focus on core knowledge. They focus on things that they weren't even bothering to test or evaluate prior to starting experiential learning. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's great if we can get students to do new and different things than they were doing before. We encourage that. But that wasn't really, even those things, they tend not to quantify very well in the literature. And so I was specifically interested in, okay, are my students demonstrating more knowledge? Because my intuition was, it doesn't seem like they're doing all that much better on these exams. So let's figure it out, right? And I got thinking about, well, how much better would it need to be for it to be meaningful to me? And I picked 5%. And that's an arbitrary figure, but there is a logic behind it. What I'm thinking about as a professor is I'm putting a lot of extra time into teaching the course this way. How much value do I need to get back for that extra time to be worth it, right? And I was like, if I average 5% better, that roughly should correspond to about half the students making a letter grade higher. And I'm like, that seems pretty reasonable, okay? 5%, it doesn't seem like, we say 5, well, that's not very much, right? But in terms of increasing average student scores, 5% is actually a pretty big deal, okay? So my dependent variable then, what I'm actually measuring is the percentage correct on multiple choice test items. I'm just looking at the multiple choice, the objective test scores, okay? Across a whole series of years. And this is essentially the chart that we end up with, okay? The big red line there is in the fall of 2017. And prior to that is the traditional sections. And after that is the experiential sections. This line right here represents the mean, the grand mean of these students back here. And so I'm looking for a 5% jump above that line, which would essentially be up here. Yeah, no, that didn't happen. Now, let me just quickly point out, there are some of these classes I did not include in the analysis. Let's see. I did not include this one. That was the smoking train wreck. So it was a lot different from any of the other ones. I did not include this one. That's 2017, and it was significantly different from all the others. And then I did not include this one because that was the fall of 2020 when we didn't even come to campus. That was during the pandemic. And that class was totally different. It was fully online, asynchronous, no FaceTime with me. And so that was really kind of a different animal. And so those three classes were substantively different from either the traditional or the experiential ones. But once you take those out and crunch the numbers, it turns out that the average on this side was 62.8 and the average on this side was 62.3.
Very sorry to interrupt.
Which sadly,
I can't tell what you mean.
It's worse instead of better. Although, fundamentally, it's basically equal. The way we look at it, there's really no change. Okay. So no real change there. Fairly disappointing for someone like me who thinks experiential learning is a great thing. Why do I think it's a great thing other than I worked on that QET, right? Well, before I got trapped into going to graduate school, I had other types of work, right? So as a soldier in the Army National Guard, I trained other soldiers, and that was experiential. And as a police officer, I was a field training officer. So I trained new police officers, right? And that was all experiential. So to me, experiential learning just makes a lot of sense. Now, there's a difference between those populations and my college student population, right? In those populations, if they didn't learn it, they got fired. Okay. In our population, we don't usually fire too many people. So if we look at that, That's fairly disappointing. Okay. The hypothesis was not confirmed. The EL section scores were virtually the same as the traditional section. Okay. So here's where we get a little more interactive. All right. Now, y'all see some professors in the room. We don't care about that. All right. We're not even going to take their questions. Well, maybe later. But I am interested in y'all's perspective, you students. Okay. When you see something like this, what is going through your mind? When you hear, okay, I understand that this professor kind of did this major re-rigging of this course and all, and he's disappointed because it didn't really make any difference, right? What are your thoughts about why students may learn more or may not learn more, may learn less in college classes? What affects how much you guys actually learn? Any ideas?
From what I've learned, it's going to be a change in living situation. From when you go from high school to college, you go from being in a kid environment to a more adult environment. And some people are in the middle of transitioning to that, or may not even know what to do or what they're doing.
Yeah.
So they have to go from not having to worry about a job or just focusing on school to focusing on school, work, paying bills, and all sorts of other things.
Yeah.
Whenever they're just newly entering adulthood.
So basically, we've got life going on. Okay, that's good. What else? Anything else?
Our phones.
Your what?
Our phones.
Your phones? That's a really good one.
It's a really good one.
Not sure how long this thing's supposed to go. I think till 1 o'clock.
Mm-hmm.
I'll take a moment to tell a story about my daughter. She's a little older than most of y'all, but she finished nursing school and she was applying for her first nursing job in a hospital, interviewing with the HR person. And the HR person asked her a question, which all of you should be prepared for because it's so common in job interviews. She asked her, well, why should you get this job instead of all the other people applying for it? My daughter was like, I don't answer that. She said, I sat there and looked at her for a minute and she said, I'm not addicted to my phone. And the lady pushed the paper across the desk and said, go right down the hall, such and such, you're hired. Yeah, your phone. That's actually an interesting question. I hadn't actually thought about that. I should have. Because in the year 2012, which was very early in this time frame, was the point where I want to say 50% of people in the United States have a smartphone. So that's a neat one. What else? What else affects your learning?
Age.
Age?
Mm-hmm.
Really?
Well, whenever you're a high school student or whatever, or just a young adult, you don't know kind of anything almost.
Mhm.
And then whenever, like I'm older,
Uh-huh.
since I'm going back to college whenever I'm older, I'm more dedicated to my work and everything.
Okay.
So age.
All right, the age, I'm gonna say maybe motivation. Because I have some young students, some of whom are very highly motivated and they are very focused. And then I have some older ones that also are. For some of I think the same reasons that you are. So I like that. I really thought you were gonna say something like you, Dr. Jordan, you're so old that I don't think you could get a bachelor's degree. I was gonna say, man, you might be right.
Brain just doesn't work.
Yeah, it just doesn't work anymore. All right, anything else? Yes, sir.
I just wanted to say how teachers teach or the kind of classes directionalize that you are getting led to, because sometimes, for example, I was in high school, I took 2 resource classes in English, 2 and 4, and going into college with little knowledge in English, and I passed comp 1 and 2 with A's, so it really just depends on
Okay.
teachers and direction.
Yeah.
What's available too.
Yeah. So I'm gonna show you something. This is just some stuff. I don't have all of y'all's up here. I wish I did, but essentially I think about it in kind of 2 levels, right? individual factors and structural factors. Okay, so individual factors is like, what's going on with the individual students? Okay, things like, how smart are you, right? And is that changing over time? Prior preparation, okay? How well were you prepared to go on and do university level work? How motivated are you? And then there's time constraints. And to me, for my population of students in criminal justice, this is a huge one, okay? Jobs. Median age of criminal justice students at this university is actually a lot older than you might think. Okay, I think it's still close to 30, okay? And so a lot of my students, even traditional age students, have jobs. I have some athletes in my major, right? So, they've got practice, they've got competitions they have to be at. Families, I have a lot of students with family obligations. I have some that are taking care of parents and grandparents, and then I have some that have kids, okay? And Netflix. Netflix is a huge obligation because you can't just watch one, you have to, okay. Sure.
No, I don't think it's one particular student I have that is an athlete, that's a parent, that has a job now, I'm sure they watch that.
I don't want to fit college into that, right? Now, here's the thing about these, right? From a professor's point of view, I can't do anything about those things. Those are beyond my control, right? I mean, I remember being a student, working, by the time I graduated, I was working like 3 part-time jobs, So yeah, I get that. There's just nothing I can really do about it. On the other hand, there are things that we can do on the core structural side, right? How many tests do I give in a term, right? Now, this is an upper division class, so I don't give a lot of tests. Although frankly, I give more now than I did back in the day. Back in the day, it was you get a midterm, a final, and a term paper, and we're done, right? Now, I think I give 3 tests usually in this class, but it has varied. There's been a semester or 2 where I gave 4. There was one that I gave 1 test, but it's not included in this data. Whether the tests are online or in the classroom, whether or not you get to retake a test, okay? Pandemic effects. Now, I obviously couldn't control the pandemic, right? But we did control how we reacted to it to a certain extent. What did we do to design the classes to try to make them work as well as possible before and after that major pandemic semester? Video conferencing, okay? There are several sections in here where we met like 50% of the time in the classroom and 50% through Zoom, okay? And so does that have any effect on scores? And class size, right? The smallest class size was about 9 and the largest was closer to 30, okay? So there was some pretty good variation, okay? And so rather than just looking at, the pre-experiential learning and with experiential learning, is there a way to kind of control some of those things? And there is, right? We're not going to get into weeds here, but essentially we use these, we call it multivariate modeling, which is, these semi-sophisticated statistics to try to figure out what is the average effect of one of these things while controlling the effects of these other things. And very quickly, we ruled out some of these, that it's like, okay, those clearly don't have an effect. Number of test attempts doesn't have an effect, which that surprised me. I actually thought that one would have an effect, right? Pandemic effects, class size, none of those had an effect. And so then it comes down to, okay, let's look at the 4 that have the most potential to have an effect. And essentially you've got 4 things here. You've got Zoom, that's the, half the class by Zoom, basically. You've got giving the test online. You've got how many tests that there are, and you've got experiential learning, whether it's experiential learning class or not. And at first we see, wow, 4 points. That's basically 4 percentage points. That's really close to my 5. And I'm like, well, that's cool, right? And yet you see that it disappears from the model. Okay, now why is that? Again, without trying to teach a statistics class, You guys all took, you remember in algebra when you did X, Y coordinates? And you had to draw a line with them, okay? Well, this statistical technique is kind of like that, except when you were doing that in math, you did a linear equation and all the dots fell on that line. Well, in real world data, the dots don't all fall on that line. In fact, they can be really spread out around the line. And so what this says is that, yeah, even though seems to be this average effect of 4 percentage points increasing for experiential learning classes, the dots around the line are so spread out that it's not a reliable estimate. And so we don't really think it's a real effect, essentially. Okay. And what's interesting is that the video conferencing seems to have a significant effect decreasing grades, right? And taking the test online seems to have a significant effect increasing the grades. Now, we can talk later about why that is.
Interesting.
Isn't that fascinating?
Wow.
Yeah. Not casting any aspersions or anything. But the bottom line here is that, experiential learning does not seem to have had the effect that we wanted it to have. And that's kind of the lesson. Does that mean that experiential learning does not work? This is the definitive research on experiential learning. It does not work. Everybody can quit now. No. It shows that in this particular circumstance, for what I was specifically measuring, it did not have an effect. It may have had some other effects that I did not measure. And it almost certainly has effects in other environments with other learning outcomes. Okay. Imagine that you're learning to put together a circuit board, except you're just doing it purely in your mind by reading a book, listening to a professor, and you never actually touched a circuit board. You're probably not going to be very good at that. Okay. And so we do conclude that, well, it doesn't have an effect in this situation for this outcome. That doesn't mean that it's useless. Okay. The second question I have up here is, does it require greater time investment? And the answer to that is yes. It requires more investment from the professor. Okay. Because all through a semester, there's this iterative feedback. It's like more like being a math teacher or a English professor who's constantly having to grade homework and give you feedback on it, right? And so it's greater time investment from that point. It's also greater time investment from the point of the students. It don't work if you don't invest the time. Okay, that's the bottom line. And these things matter. This research relates to a specific population, okay? It's not a general test of experiential learning across all college student populations. It's within a particular academic culture in terms of what are the expectations of what students should do and what kind of grade students should get within the university or within our college, okay? Because those things have an effect on what I as a student think I'm supposed to be investing in it. And then the big one that I always point out for my students is this issue of time. A lot of my students, they have real time constraints that limit the amount of time that they're going to put into their courses. All right. So we'll say, what questions do you have?
All right, well, first we'll say thank you, Dr. Durden. Here we go. We probably have, a minute or so, I suppose, for a quick question, or if Dr. Jordan is amenable, you can always email them to him.
Show the comparison between traditional and experiential learning. It really shows something significant. What does that tell us? That means there's no difference at all, or
Basically,
is the find your data and the method of how the data is collected should be.
well, the issue, anytime we're dealing with this kind of research, you know, we can question, okay, well, was the data consistent? I'm gonna argue that it was, right? Because it has the same validity as any exam that professors write. Okay. The other issues that are in terms of quality of data, I think have more to do with the structures of the form, like, well, let me go back before I talk about structures, let me talk about the quality of data. We change our tests over time, right? Okay, and so what is the likelihood that experiential learning actually had this significant effect? That because I was writing harder and harder questions. Okay, then if that didn't show up. Well, I would argue if anything, it's probably the other way around, that, you know, you professor didn't. We probably train easier rather than harder. And so there's that issue. The other thing is that I'm writing the questions, and when I replace questions, I tend to replace them with questions that are approximately equal difficulty and testing things like that. So I'm comfortable with that. In terms of the structure of that question, that is how the tests were given. That one is actually, I think, a good question, you know, in terms of, okay, and particularly the in-class versus online, okay? I was really surprised that allowing students to take the test more than once. Now, they don't get the same questions, but it's the same content. You know, I was surprised that that didn't really have an effect. But I wasn't terribly surprised because I've watched my students, and one of the things I've noticed is that most of them don't take the test the same. It's fairly few. And when they do take it a second time, it doesn't tend to change the score much. Some will go up a little, some will go down a little. But it doesn't seem to have much. The taking the test online. That I think has a significant effect. And you wonder. Yeah, that's kind of a whole nother ballgame in higher education. So, and actually, I tell people when they ask me about trends in higher education, I tell them 10 years from now, a student's diploma won't be worth anything if they didn't graduate from an institution that made them write in the classroom and take tests in the classroom. Because, you know, the world is catching on to the fact that these online degrees, so. There's an employer here in town who hires people in the engineering area. And when they tell him where they graduated, he tells them straight up, I don't care. If you have a college diploma, all it means to me is you have the ability to endure hours of boredom and cheat. I want to know what can you actually do.
Okay. Well, always good to end on a non-controversial note. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, so all your degrees are useless. All right, so we'll say thank you to Dr. Jordan. And I do have some questions in the chat that I will have you hopefully respond to via. Oh, yeah. Let's applaud you again. So since there may be a class coming in here at 1, I will go ahead and say if you are in the room and you haven't signed in yet, please do so. It helps me justify my continued existence. Whether you're a student or not, I don't care. So go ahead and sign up. And our next honors colloquium will be, I think, in a couple of weeks. We have Dr. Yells and Dr. Yells, and you'll be getting some information about that. And thank you, Tom. I appreciate it. I will stop the recording.